Today on This Week Health.
At a more macro level, it's very clear that whether you are a security organization, whether you are a large critical infrastructure organization, you are perpetually in the crosshairs these days of these bad actors, of these threat actors. So you need to always assume the worst in terms of their nefarious aims and trying to penetrate your systems.
It's Newsday. My name is Bill Russell. I'm a former CIO for a 16-hospital system and creator of This Week Health, a channel dedicated to keeping health IT staff current and engaged. Special thanks to CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, ClearSense, Meditech, Cedars-Sinai Accelerator, TalkDesk, and Dr. First, who are our Newsday show sponsors for investing in our mission to develop the next generation of health leaders. All right, here we are. It is Newsday. And today we were joined by Ryan Witt with Proofpoint. Ryan, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here. I always enjoy these conversations.
Yeah, this is the week following the HIMSS conference, and Proofpoint had I'm not going to call it a booth, but you hosted a rest area. Is that what happened?
We had a lounge. We had to make a call during the height of Omicron about what are we or were we not going to be at HIMSS. We had already made some investment in HIMSS, so we decided not to go a full presence and send large numbers of staff, a couple 3 dozen number of staff. So we decided to create a little bit of a lounge sort of experience because we had that basically that real estate to work with. So we were there in very minimal numbers, but I kind of wish, upon reflection, given what I saw at HIMSS and given I saw the level of engagement and the number of people who were there, I kind of wish I understand the call that we made, but I wish we were there in a much more significant way because it was a good show, I thought.
It's hard to make those calls. You're sitting there, you're looking at these numbers, you're going, which way is it going to go? Is there going to be another strain? And we have no idea. So leadership has to make those calls. Sometimes they're the correct calls, sometimes they're not, as evidenced by last year's decision by HIMSS to go to Vegas at a time where it spiked and they got hammered. I mean, the conference was not well attended. And so you have to make those bets, but it seems like, let's see, the official number I saw was 28,000 were there. I don't know. I didn't really read it that closely, but what I was telling people is it felt like between 20 and 25,000 were there. So 28 would not be outside the realm. Yeah. There was activity, there was noise, there was energy on the floor the entire time. I can't really speak to who was there. I mean, I have made some comments that the CIOs went to the ViVE conference because that's where their association is. That's where Chime was. There were some CIOs at the HIMSS event. We tracked a bunch of them down and had conversations. But I will say, and some of them were even around doing what I normally did, which was booth to booth, meeting with strategic vendors while I was, if I'm going to go to the event, I could really hammer out 4 or 5, maybe even 10 meetings in a very short period of time. So I saw that happening. I guess the question is, was it worth a lot of the booths were scaled down. The Epic booth was, I mean, my estimation was half the size of what it usually is.
Many booths were like that, yeah.
Yeah, and so it felt like everybody sort of scaled down a little bit, but it still was a very big floor. I mean, to get from one end to the other was not a small task. I guess the question is it worth? One of the vendors said to me, we spent $400,000 all in for the HIMSS event. Is it worth $400,000, or is it just one of those events you have to be at?
I think from a Proofpoint standpoint and from vendors like Proofpoint who have a significant focus and attention on the healthcare industry, we have to be there. It's a table stake sort of event. We're in the cybersecurity business, so I would have related to. I mean, those are 2 shows, and there are, from an investment standpoint, there are 2 largest investment in terms of single events that we do year in, year out. So I kind of think you have to be there. Is it ever worth it? It's always hard to measure that ROI. But I feel like the demise of the trade show, which has been
greatly exaggerated.
Right. I think there's definitely a lot of runway for these events. The intangibles that you kind of reference in terms of the buzz, the engagement on the floor, the traffic, kind of the euphoria of just being back together and having something like a normal sort of business sort of relationship, a sort of a business setting to be strong. I mean, that's an intangible sort of statement. I can't quantify it really, but it kind of felt like people were really happy to be there. And I think want to do more of that sort of stuff. I mean, it's always going to be dependent upon business climate, and then what's the next variant going to throw at us, et cetera. What's BA2 going to do? But I feel like this will be a part of the healthcare, health IT landscape for a long time coming. You see how ViVE, what happens with ViVE. I mean, the Chime brand is very valuable, and we understand the importance of ViVE as well, or certainly Chime. And so if they can use that sort of new platform to kind of grow, I'm sure many vendors like Proofpoint are watching that very closely, with the idea that at some stage it's something we also will be attending as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've labeled both of these conferences a success. ViVE was about 5,000 and HIMSS, I thought HIMSS, my prediction going into it, I was completely off. I thought if they peaked 10,000, I would be surprised. And so I'm surprised.
Likewise.
I think both of them are considered a success. I think going into next year, marketing departments will have to figure out where to spend their money. It felt to me like influencers were at the second event, were at the HIMSS event, and the budget, the buyer, was at the first event. But I don't know. I mean, that's maybe not fair. I'd have to really do some analysis before I get there.
My periscope is much more narrow, so I don't feel like the security buyers were so much at the first event, ViVE, but I felt like they were more present at HIMSS.
So who are the security buyers? This is a decent conversation, actually. So those used to report into CIOs, and we've seen some split out and now go into compliance and legal, which is really interesting. I mean, who are the security buyers at this point?
It's a good question, and I'll answer it maybe this way. So where we have seen the most success in terms of health systems or large IDNs, or just more broadly the healthcare industry, making the sort of investments that are commensurate with their peers in other industries, so they're similar size organization in other industries, it's those CISOs or those InfoSec teams, those IT teams, who have directly related the importance of a cybersecurity posture to healthcare's overall mission. So those who still think about it in terms of a compliancy requirement, sure, that's important, but we find that they have a hard time translating the importance of making that investment back to the hospital board in a way that's meaningful in return. Those that purely see it as just purely like a security play or privacy play, again, have that difficulty. But when you start referencing some of the big outages that we've seen, I don't need to name check all the organizations because they've been name checked multiple times, where they basically have not been able to provide patient care for weeks on end. They're having to recreate patient records on pieces of paper. They're having to send their oncology patients to neighboring health systems, and a whole number of other examples. Those hospital boards acutely get it. They acutely understand that a cyber event essentially totally kneecaps them in terms of their ability to provide patient care, meet their mission. And those ones who experience that understand the importance of the investment, and those who are watching from the sidelines in a considered manner also understand that. And I think the InfoSec teams that can convey that are the ones that are the most successful at securing the needed investment. So who is the security buyer? It probably still is centered on the CISO, but I think the CTO plays a significant role there. The CIO, depending on what function that CIO provides, whether he's more of an operational or this kind of like the digital transformation style CIO, those roles play a role. And the CFO, of course, is always never far away from that consideration, considering the amount of money often needed to go make these things happen.
Yeah, whenever you say the word money, the CFO is not far away. We'll get to our show in just a minute. As you've probably heard, we've launched a new show, Town Hall, on our community channel, This Week Health Community, and it airs on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'll be taking a back seat to some of these people who are on the front lines. Town Hall is hosted by an array of talented healthcare leaders who are facing today's challenges head on. We're going to hear from professionals and their networks on hot button issues, technical deep dives, and the tactical challenges that healthcare faces. We have some great hosts on this. We have Charles Boise and Angelique Russell, data scientists, Craig Richardville, Lee Milligan, Reed Steffen, who are all CIOs. We have Jake Lancaster and Brett Oliver, who are CMIOs, and Matt Sickles, a cybersecurity first responder. I'd love to have you listen to these episodes. You can subscribe on our community channel, This Week Health Community, wherever you find and listen to podcasts. Now, let's get to the show. We're going to do something a little different if you're watching on video. So I'm going to pull up the story that we're going to be talking about right now. We're going to start with one that you just brought to my attention. I said, hey, let's talk about some security things. And you said, did you see this? And I guess it's a story that's unfolding as we speak. Authentication firm Okta says it has found no evidence of new attack after hackers claim breach. So Okta is an authentication identity management software company that is used by more than 15,000 organizations, a bunch of those being healthcare. Hacking group, Lapsus. How do you pronounce that? Lapsus.
Lapsus, yeah. Who are generally considered to be, I hate to use the word credible, but I mean, when they make these statements, people take their statements seriously. On the whole like Twitterati, that's sort of to those who pay attention to what goes on Twitter. They tend to pay attention when this organization makes a claim like this. So it's treated with some credence.
So they posted screenshots on its Telegram channel claiming it had access to a number of Okta systems. The company said it had detected an attempt to compromise the account of a third-party customer support engineer working for one of its processors in January, but had found no evidence of ongoing malicious activity. At this point, we can assume if they're finding something, they're going to report it. I mean, the companies that try to hide this stuff get just absolutely annihilated, don't they?
They do. They get pilloried, and I think it's just no. And it looks like Okta's being pretty transparent here, which is absolutely the right approach. So and this is, as you can see from the date of this story, this is definitely kind of breaking style news, and so probably don't know much more about than what's being posted here. But I think at a more macro level, it's very clear that whether you are a security organization, whether you are a large sort of a critical infrastructure organization, you are perpetually in the crosshairs these days of these bad actors, these threat actors. So you need to always assume the worst in terms of their nefarious aims and trying to penetrate these systems, your systems.
Yeah. How's healthcare experiencing that? If I'm an Okta customer today, I assume they contacted me pretty early on to say, hey, we are researching a breach. So the thing is in hey, we're researching a breach mode right now. How am I supposed to be thinking about this as a security person within a healthcare organization? Am I supposed to be saying, all right, making contingency plans? Or I would assume a lot of those contingency plans are already in place.
Yeah, I think yes, you need to have the contingency plan as kind of an ongoing sort of planning process. I mean, if you're not doing that, then you have some exposure, right? If health systems didn't learn this, say from ransomware, about what do you do if this sort of cataclysmic event were to occur, whether it's a system being breached or your whole health system network being breached, you need to have those sort of plans in place. I think in this particular instance, you need to train and educate your users to look for anything that's out of the ordinary. So this is to focus on authentication. And so if you're getting your systems asking people to authenticate multiple times throughout the course of a day or whatever, that should trigger an alarm, right? That should be a red flag. So, but instead of like going into each sort of what if statement, I think in this instance here, you need to train your users to look out for anything that's out of ordinary. So if something is like, if the system is asking you to do things it doesn't normally do, you need to flag that back up to your IT team or your security team and make them aware of that. Because that's going to be, the users are such an important part of the defensive posture for any organization, healthcare or otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll go straight into, we have two cyber stories, so we'll go right into this one. This one's interesting. MIT Technology Review said inside the plan to fix America's never-ending cybersecurity failures. And really what this focuses in on is the public-private interaction on these things, I guess is the way to say it. And the story they start with is the 2021 hack of the Colonial Pipeline, the biggest fuel pipeline in the United States, ended with thousands of panicked Americans hoarding gas and fuel shortages across the Eastern Seaboard. Basic cybersecurity failures let the hackers in. And then the company made the unilateral decision to pay $5 million in ransom and shut down much of the East Coast fuel supply without consulting the US government until it was time to clean up the mess. From across the Atlantic, Syrian Martin looked on in baffled amazement. The brutal assessment of the Colonial hack is that the company made decisions off a narrow commercial self-interest. Everything else is for the government to pick up, says Martin, previously the United Kingdom's top cybersecurity official. Now some of the US top cybersecurity officials, including the White House current cyber director, say the time has come for stronger government role and regulation in cybersecurity so that fiascos like Colonial don't happen again. I think I'll stop there and just get your initial thoughts on the Colonial pipeline, how it was handled. And actually, I think some things have changed just as a result of that in terms of how we think about these things ahead of time. But what are your initial thoughts?
I mean, I think it's always hard to pass too much judgment on an organization who decides to take a stand and how they're going to rectify their cyber event. You don't really know the pressures they're under. There was a point in time in, say, for healthcare, for example, that systems were kind of being shamed if they paid the ransom demand. I've heard a lot of systems push back and say, hey, you don't know to what degree we had patient safety compromised. And we made a judgment that said we had to pay it right away. Otherwise, there was legitimate concerns that people were at significant risk. And so I think it's always hard to understand unless you're really in their shoes. That being said, and I think this is kind of the thrust of this article, is it goes on to talk a lot about what is the US government's role meant to be going forward. And they use the UK example as a juxtaposition about how strong of a role the UK government plays in their overall cybersecurity posture across industries and across the National Health Service. There is a very significant compare and contrast. We as a country have a lot more exposure, as is exampled here by the Colonial pipeline, because there isn't essentially overarching requirements put on us from the US government to go have certain levels of cybersecurity protection in place. That article talks about like the importance of the Clean Water Act, the importance of FDA and other sort of similar sort of organizations that we did put meaningful regulation in place, and that meaningful regulation in place was definitely beneficial to us as a country as a whole. And if you look at some of the more recent initiatives, the executive orders are from the Biden administration, some of those things that are potentially going to be codified into law time in the next few weeks, probably through some sort of omnibus act through Congress. It's not clear truly what the benefit of these initiatives or these laws are going to be, just because there's a lot of suggestions, there's a lot of recommendations around capability, there's broader recommendations around improving reporting, embracing things like zero trust, but there's not a lot of teeth. There's not a lot of requirement to do these things.
It's interesting. I mean, there's a couple of statements in this article. One, this is Chris Inglis, the White House National Cybersecurity Director. Biden's top advisor for cybersecurity said, when critical functions that serve the needs of society are at issue, some things are just not discretionary. And he's talking about health. I mean, he's talking about a lot of things here. He's talking about the pipeline, but he's also talking about healthcare, right? He's saying when healthcare is under attack, it's something that we as a country are impacted. We as a community are impacted. And one of the reasons we have a federal government is to protect us from foreign actors who are going to attack us. I'm on record as saying for years, it felt like we had the equivalent of aircraft carriers parked off the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and they were just launching cyber attack after cyber attack. And it felt like in the case of a physical attack, we would absolutely scramble all resources and do something.
Right.
But in the case of a cyber attack, we were sort of sitting there going, well, should the federal government do something, or is the market going to take care of it? And are we going to, and we weren't really coalescing around this. It would seem, I'm trying to think why that would be. What's the bipartisan aspect of this? to protect the country, to protect the citizens, to protect our infrastructure would seem to be bipartisan, right? We all agree. Now, we may not all agree on how, but we should all agree on we pay taxes. We don't want our hospitals shut down. But I'm not sure what, and I think this is what you're saying too. There's no teeth, but there's no adopt zero trust. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, every health system I'm talking to says adopt zero trust. And I think the maturity of that looks very different from one health system to another.
Sure. But there is a playbook we can gravitate towards, and listeners of this podcast will be very familiar with the playbook I'm going to reference. And that is when we decided as a country, driven by the federal government, that we are going to digitize the patient record, right? They put significant, and I know there was a lot of challenges with how that worked. Okay. And if you did it all over again, you might do things differently. But we went from a point in time when essentially the patient record was broadly not digitized. And then 5, 6, 7 years later, most of the country had some sort of EMR, EHR in place. And yes, we have interoperability challenges and all that, but we are looking to solve that as well. But there was very clear requirements there was very clear money available on the table to go help health systems achieve the digitization of the patient record. There were very clear requirements you had to satisfy to get some of those funds. And there were timelines. The timeline would go from carrot to a stick at some sort of stage. And you went from a piece of legislation that actually did essentially achieve what it was aiming to achieve. And so I feel like we can learn some lessons from that about how to maybe make that better. But in terms of how do you get the whole country to buy into legislation, there is a path here that we can follow. Now, it won't be easy to get that bipartisan support for that, because nothing is really particularly easy in a bipartisan fashion within the Beltway these days. But I like to see us put more effort on that sort of a program, which definitely would have teeth, would have funding, and something we would all understand and get, and probably for the most part get behind.
Yeah, it's interesting. They do compare and contrast the UK's approach to this, and it's he uses some salty language to describe what they would have done in the UK if the Colonial Pipeline had happened there. He essentially says we would have got them on the phone and said, "What the heck are you guys doing?" And we would have torn them to pieces verbally in the media and whatnot. As I look at this is an interesting back and forth. Happens all the time in terms of we have events that shape how we think about things, and then we do this pendulum of we want a significant amount of government oversight all the way back to, you know what, too much oversight on this side. We need to move back to more self-regulation and that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting balancing act, but I don't know. In his words in the article, it still seems a little confused. And yes, there are absolutely playbooks out there. And for health systems, the NIST framework is phenomenal. And that's what we followed. And there's a whole bunch of frameworks to follow out there. It's not like you have to go it alone. They're helping us along the way.
And the 405D team, that kind of public-private partnership with Health and Human Services and some other organizations, private organizations, they're putting together this whole catalog of cybersecurity preparedness sort of documentation, kind of like detailed playbooks that are for the most part mapped onto NIST controls. So there's no shortage of material to go help a CISO or a healthcare organization go figure out what to do, but there's not any sort of mandatory requirement to do it. And I think that's where the whole meaningful use initiative definitely helped solve some of that problem. And I get it. I mean, the whole challenge of, do we want more or less government control in these sort of situations? It's that pendulum will perpetually swing, and we don't necessarily always know what the right answer is going to be. And that right answer might change from time to time. But if we don't address this in a structural way, then we're going to have more colonial pipelines. And so we can shake our head, we can furrow our brow and accept it, or we have to do something different.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. So two stories really to close with. One is from Modern Healthcare. Will a digital health bubble burst? The other one is Teladoc launches telehealth model for employers. I think both of them are interesting. Let's start with the digital health bubble. We both went to HIMSS. Clearly, digital is front and center, and people are talking about all sorts of new models. We heard AI talked about. I actually saw some AI models that are truly AI models and truly making a difference in terms of efficiency and quality of outcomes in certain spaces within healthcare. So I mean, I hear people saying, "What's the hype for this year?" And it's AI and ML, but I think we label it as hype to our own detriment because there's some areas where they're making some progress. But when, my gosh, we go to these conferences every year and you see the number of players and you see the numbers. I mean, the number that is the VC deals going into healthcare is just kind of staggering and continues to set records year after year. And it always brings up that question of, do these valuations make sense? And will there be a digital health bubble burst over time? You probably talked to some companies. I mean, the ViVE event had more startups and more VC there and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because it was related to the health conference. And yeah, some of the numbers are pretty staggering that these, hey, we're raising this much for our series B or series A. And you're like, okay, do you have any revenue? It's like, well, we're not making a profit yet, but they're look at the potential here and that kind of stuff. Being somebody in healthcare, a lot of times I'll look at them and I go, I think I could do what you're doing with this, this, and this. It would be nice to consolidate, but I already have those three things in place. So I'm probably not going to be running down the hall to embrace what you're doing. And I'm not sure, I wonder if VC and the money chasing the digital health world is sophisticated enough to identify if the buyers are really going to pay for what these people are building.
I have the situation where I'm based in Silicon Valley, right? And as a result, I get access to a lot of sort of these sort of conversations, basically. It's interesting to me because you see two main types of companies who tend to get in the digital space. One is often a founder with a clinical sort of background who invented the better widget, a better way of doing something, right? Or you have the technologist who looks at healthcare and says, this thing is crazy. There's so many inefficiencies here. My widget can go solve problems much more efficiently. And I think in both cases, they're probably a lot more right than wrong. I mean, of course, you always have this, to what degree is the founder or the inventor or the entrepreneur developing a solution for a problem doesn't truly exist. You always have a little bit of that. But one of the things I see too frequently, though, is you might have this capability that the clinician or the clinical expert sees like that would be beneficial, or you might have the technology view about what might work. But too frequently, there is a lack of understanding about the business of healthcare. They understand the clinical side, they understand the technology side, but they don't understand necessarily the business of healthcare. So, and I think that's to the degree where the digital health bubble might burst is there could be a lot of money going in, capability or technology to a solution, and it's not a reimbursable event, for example. So it's like, hey, sounds great. I love to be able to use this capability, but I can't get reimbursed for it. So there's no way, it's just not going to be adopted, right? Until you get that changed. And as we know, that's a very significant challenge within healthcare. That being said, we have to also recognize that just look at our healthcare ecosystem and look at the players and the names that we think about or talk about, or our friends or our family talk about, and think about who those names were yesteryear. All of a sudden, Walmart's part of healthcare, Amazon's part of healthcare, Walgreens is much more substantially part of healthcare, CVS is much more substantially part of healthcare. Apple is trying. So the interlopers, the disruptors are on the sidelines and have, in many cases, crept onto the field of play. And the healthcare total addressable market from a financial sort of standpoint hasn't really grown. It's essentially, it's largely the same, which means if you are a traditional healthcare provider, your ability to service that addressable market does diminish because there's others who are eating that same pie, if you want to use an analogy. So it's a challenging one. I fear that healthcare needs to embrace digital health. The traditional players need to embrace it more, because if you don't, we put ourselves at risk of being disrupted from organizations who maybe don't historically haven't understood healthcare, but you saw evidence of HIMSS, of how some booths have really evolved over the last 10 years about their messaging into healthcare. It's like, yeah, 10 years ago, you kind of dipped your toe in the water, and 10 years later, you're kind of like waist deep now in your healthcare sort of knowledge and your capability and your relevancy. So I kind of feel like digital health is kind of one of the last sort of bastions of the transformation agenda. Industries have not gone through that transformation. So I don't think we could stop this wave.
It's interesting. Every time we have this conversation, I'm taken back to some of the other interviews that I've done, and it's the equation payer. It has to benefit the payer, the provider, or the patient. And in the payer world, I'll also put the employer, right? So the employer, payer, provider, or patient in some way. The reality is the patient's unwilling to pay for anything. So those models where they say, hey, we're going directly to the patient and they're going to pay, I just sort of shake my head and go, all right, well, you're creating a new revenue stream, because right now, if my insurance carrier doesn't pay for it, there's very little I pay for. And it comes down to where can you make a market? And when they say we're going to get the provider to pay for it, I'm reminded of being a CIO and sitting there going, look, we have 900 applications. I'm not trying to add to that unless there's a significant new capability that you're going to give me, or quality improvement or something. I'm not looking to add to that number of applications. And so I hear everybody talking about platforms. I want platforms that allow me to do multiple things that I couldn't. I don't want to add, again, I don't want to add 10 apps to do something. I'd rather add one platform that has the ability to leverage the data and the security model and the architecture for one system to perform 10 things. This is why you hear people say, if Epic can do it, if Cerner can do it, that's how I'm going to do it. I'm not going to add another application. And then you go, well, the Epic solution is only 70% as good as the state-of-the-art solution. And then they just look at you like, yeah, but the cost, the complexity, the whatever. So anyone who's taking on Epic, and I think more and more people have gotten out of that game, anyone who's taking on Epic or one of the established players in there, it's hard to get your foot in the door on the clinical application side for that reason.
On that topic, a question on that topic though. So at some stage, I guess we're going to have this EMR 2.0 sort of event. Maybe we're not far away from it, but can you see a change on that landscape of who could disrupt that? I don't necessarily see one right now.
No, I think what you're seeing is that's the system of record, and we're gonna layer things on top of it and put a set of APIs on top of it. Maybe even create a whole new UI UX experience, but underneath it, you're still going to shove the information into Epic, so shove it into Cerner, and maybe those two companies will create the new UX and UI around it that's more efficient and more internet architecture, if you will, because today they're not internet, they're barely internet architecture. Wow. You can see it from there, but it's just not how it was designed. So no, I don't see the 2.0 player and where it's going to come from today. And the other reason is you just rattled off a $300 million project. Hey, let's replace the EHR. It's got to be an incremental replacement that is not a $300 million lift, but a manageable lift. Depends on the size of the budget, obviously, but a manageable lift for a significant return. Otherwise, nobody's going to be moving away. All of our devices are integrated into that EHR now. All of our data workflows are integrated into the EHR. It's hard to see that next move, to be honest with you. Other thing I always think about when I see this digital health revolution, and you talked about some of the players, and I talked to Rob DiMache, former CFO for UPMC, when we were talking about the demise of the provider. Okay, so this is somebody who is CFO for a significant provider in that market space. And he said, Bill, it's not going to be like all of a sudden you wake up one day and somebody put a new form of healthcare down the road and you're going to start shutting down your hospitals. what's going to happen is death by 1,000 cuts. It's yes, took a little of this, the surgery center took a little of this, and they took a little bit of this. And now all of a sudden you're looking down at your balance sheet and you're looking at your operating revenue, and your operating revenue dropped and your profit margin just went negative. And you're like, oh, well, we've got to do more of what makes us money that did in the past. But what you haven't taken into account is you have a whole new set of competitors that have essentially created an ecosystem that's more efficient than you. Well, are we going to let the hospital in a market die? Because that's in a free market economy, that's what happens. They die and other things pop up in its place. But nobody wants certain aspects of the low margin, high acuity care. Only the hospitals are taking that. So if you just let the high margin, low risk stuff all go somewhere else, you're going to bleed the hospitals dry. It creates an interesting, again, we get back to this. What's the community going to say? And what's the regulation going to say when our hospitals start losing money? And they are going to start losing money because these players, when we talk about Amazon, somebody's like, is Amazon going to buy a hospital or build a hospital? And the answer is never in our lifetime are they going to build a hospital. They'll do healthcare, but they'll do it very different than how it's done today.
They'll contribute to those 1,000 cuts.
They will. And they will be deep cuts. I mean, they're going after the pharmacy business. Well, the pharmacy business is fairly profitable. I'm looking at some of this. The imaging centers get popped up by a former doctor who becomes entrepreneur, sets up imaging centers. They look at, they know it. They're looking at it going, man, every time we do an image, here's the profit margin. And every time somebody comes in, we redo the images. It's an interesting dilemma. And I think healthcare is getting beaten up slowly by a 1,000 cuts. And we see it more and more. To be honest with you, though, you mentioned Apple. Apple to me is the exception. And the reason they're the exception is they're not trying to make money in healthcare per se. They're still trying to sell devices, right? They're trying to sell watches. They're trying to sell phones. They're trying to sell services, data services, and that kind of stuff. There, in no way right now, I think, do I see Apple even remotely heading in the direction of providing care in any way. Would you say that's accurate?
I think it's 100% accurate. I mean, Apple's business model is very pure and very clear. They're trying to sell, as you say, kind of small number of core devices and increasingly more services. Now, will one of those services become healthcare related over time? We'll see. And will one of those healthcare services be one of those smaller, deeper cuts? We'll see.
I think Apple has a great opportunity to solve the interoperability problem, to be honest with you.
They do.
I mean,
they do, and they have the incredibly trusted brand as well.
Right.
So they have the very unique space from a business context of being essentially the Rolls-Royce style market, most highly valued brand, but also in many cases having the Toyota or Nissan or GM style of distribution. So it's like very rare you find somebody to be the high price leader and then the most dominant player from an adoption standpoint. But they're one of those brands, and that talks about their prowess in business and the loyalty which with customers hold that brand. And so, the moment they decide they want to get into some of these services, and if they're already dabbling in healthcare quite significantly. You could just look at the number of Apple Watches that were at HIMSS and how those watches in many cases are being used. It'll be interesting to see what they do.
The other one I think that's a big winner in healthcare right now that doesn't necessarily provide care is Microsoft, right? So they just sit over there and say, you want some SQL services, you want some AI, you want some, I mean, we all have contracts with Microsoft because you almost have to at this point, but they just provide services in and around healthcare, and they'll provide them for CVS or Walgreens. They'll provide them for Amazon. They'll provide them for providers. They'll provide them for payers. And so anybody who has a business model like that supports the entire ecosystem of healthcare, they're hitting the entire addressable $3 trillion market of players in that space.
I totally agree. And particularly in healthcare where, cloud adoption is a little bit behind other industries, and Microsoft has a pretty significant and compelling cloud offering. So you can land a lot of your new apps, your new services, or use your existing app or services and land on their cloud. You can see they got a particularly strong message there.
Let me close with this one. It's not one we've talked about, but so Meditech is either the third or fourth largest EHR provider. I think they're the third largest EHR provider.
Yeah.
They're one of the least expensive to operate. And so you'll see them in a lot of smaller facilities across the country. They now have Meditech Expanse, which is really good for ambulatory clinics and those kind of things. They announced a partnership with Google. And their partnership with Google is about bringing the Google interface to the EHR, right? So the search capabilities of, now I'm sure there's going to be more to this partnership, but anytime somebody says, hey, we're partnering with Google around healthcare, people get antsy. And I saw a couple posts of how could they do this without consulting the patient and that kind of stuff. And the reality is I read the announcement in its entirety. It has nothing to do with data. They're not sharing any data with them whatsoever. It literally is bringing their search capabilities to the breadth of medical data that's out there. So you could, again, single box, go in there and say, pull up the labs from blah, 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 and the labs pop up, because that Google is extremely good at organizing mass amounts of data. And it doesn't matter if it's structured or unstructured, they're really good at that. So that's what that announcement was about. But still, Google struggles from this. Anytime they get anywhere near healthcare, people think they're going to use that data for evil. I remember they used to be do no evil was sort of their thing, but now it's almost, they're assumed to be evil from the get-go. It's kind of a tough situation for them.
Well, I think the other factor that people think about too with Google and healthcare is they have this kind of fast fail mentality. That's kind of the ethos of the company, and they have fast failed in healthcare a few times, right? They've done some pretty significant initiatives or kind of entered it, and then but didn't last very long, right? So I think it's easy to look at this one and get jaded and say, okay, here we go again. But I think you're right. This is a little bit different in that they're bringing the search engine, which the significant part of the world uses, is comfortable with, understands, and they're bringing it to bear within that Meditech environment. I think it's a great partnership, and one that been kind of quite a coup for Meditech, really, given that they are the third player in this marketplace and generally does tend to work in the more kind of smaller to medium critical access style hospitals. I think it's a great capability that they're bringing to their customer base, and one that I think will do them a lot of favors, and I think the customer base would really like, and probably is not as vulnerable to sort of that cynicism which we can understandably associate to Google in this space.
Yeah, and I talked to some people from Meditech, and they were talking about the agreement specifically and the protections that are in there in terms of the data, and Google just doesn't have access to the data. I'm not sure how it works, but I guess they somehow embed their appliance within it. It scours all that stuff, and that information never goes up to the cloud, up to Google. It's sort of built into the EHR somehow. So right. Very interesting. Ryan, hey, I want to thank you again for coming on the show. It was great to get your feedback on HIMSS and the events that are going on even as we speak in the cybersecurity world. Fantastic to catch up with you.
I enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Bill. Talk to you soon.
What a great discussion. If you know of someone that might benefit from our channel from these kinds of discussions, please forward them a note, perhaps your team, your staff. I know if I were a CIO today, I would have every one of my team members listening to a show just like this one. It's conference level value every week. They can subscribe on our website, thisweekhealth.com. They can also subscribe wherever they listen to podcasts, Apple, Google, Overcast. You get the picture. We are everywhere. Go ahead, subscribe today. We want to thank our Newsday sponsors who are investing in our mission to develop the next generation of health leaders. Those are CrowdStrike, Proofpoint, ClearSense, Meditech, Cedars-Sinai Accelerator, TalkDesk, and Dr. First. Thanks for listening. That's all for now.